The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Hospital hummed with a sound that felt like a migraine taking physical form, vibrating against Eliza Hartwell's temples as she sprinted down the sterilized corridor toward the loading dock. Her phone screamed in her pocket, a third missed call from the gala committee, demanding to know why the centerpieces were wilting, but her attention was fixed on the scene unfolding near the biohazard disposal units. Two security guards, their uniforms straining against thickened torsos, had Calvin Rowe pinned against the gray brick wall, one hand twisting the collar of his grease-stained jumpsuit while the other rifled through his pockets with invasive, careless cruelty. Calvin did not fight back, his eyes fixed on the floor, his posture accepting the abuse with a terrifying stillness that spoke of a lifetime of being treated as furniture, yet Eliza saw the slight tremor in his jaw that betrayed a hidden, volatile intelligence. She stopped, her breath catching in a throat raw from exhaustion, realizing that the man they were treating like trash was the only person in the building who noticed the discrepancies in the disposal logs. The guard laughed, a wet, ugly sound, and tossed a small, battered notebook onto the wet concrete, unaware that he had just discarded the most dangerous object in the city. Watch closely, because the man picking up that book isn't just wiping off mud, he is memorizing the face of the man who pushed him. The collision between the sterile misery of the emergency room and the opulence of the impending winter gala created a dissonance that made Eliza feel as though she were living in two incompatible realities simultaneously. She spent her morning fighting insurance adjusters for a pediatric patient's chemotherapy approval, her voice cracking with suppressed rage, only to spend her afternoon arguing about the shade of cream for the linen napkins. Calvin Rowe moved through both worlds like a specter, pushing his heavy cart of tools and cleaning supplies, his presence ignored by the surgeons and the wealthy donors alike, rendering him effectively invisible. He was fixing a leaking pipe beneath the gala's main stage when Malcolm Vane arrived, the corporate chairperson sweeping into the ballroom with an entourage of sycophants who laughed too loudly at his jokes. Malcolm's suit cost more than Calvin's annual salary, a fact that the maintenance tech seemed to understand as he wiped grease from his hands and stepped back into the shadows. Eliza watched from the balcony, holding a clipboard like a shield, noting how Malcolm's eyes scanned the room not with appreciation, but with a predatory assessment of value and weakness. The air grew colder as Malcolm approached the stage, his polished shoes stopping inches from where Calvin was kneeling, and for a moment, the silence was absolute. He kicked Calvin's toolbox aside without breaking stride, a casual display of dominance that signaled to everyone present exactly where the power lay in this room. Eliza flinched, her instinct to intervene warring with the paralyzing knowledge that her job, and the hospital wing she supported, depended entirely on Malcolm's erratic goodwill. Calvin didn't look up, didn't speak, didn't apologize for existing in the great man's path, but his fingers tightened around the wrench he was holding until his knuckles turned the color of bone. It was a small moment, a microscopic fracture in the social order, but Eliza felt the weight of it settle in her stomach like lead, a premonition of violence wrapped in silk. Later, she would wonder if Calvin had planned to be there, if he had wanted to test the man who claimed to be the city's savior, or if he was simply doing a job no one else wanted. The gala was meant to celebrate charity, yet the foundation of the event was built on the backs of men like Calvin, who were expected to fix the cracks and then disappear. As the rehearsal music swelled, drowning out the sound of tools clattering on the floor, Eliza caught Calvin's eye across the cavernous room. There was no anger in his gaze, only a chilling, mathematical calculation that terrified her more than any rage ever could. What is he counting, she wondered, and why does he look like a man who knows the answer to a question no one has asked yet? The humiliation in the ballroom had been a public spectacle, but the aftermath in the loading dock was a private, aching quiet that drew Eliza toward Calvin like a moth to a dangerous flame. She found him sitting on a stack of pallets, nursing a cut on his hand where the toolbox had struck him, the blood bright and stark against the grime of his uniform. Without asking for permission, she opened her first aid kit, the smell of antiseptic cutting through the scent of rain and diesel fumes, and knelt beside him to clean the wound. His skin was rough, calloused from years of labor, but his hands were steady, and when he looked at her, the mask of the simple janitor slipped for a fraction of a second. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small space, lacking the subservience she heard when he spoke to supervisors. "Malcolm Vane doesn't like his assets mixing with the liabilities," he added, a bitter edge sharpening the words, revealing a vocabulary that didn't match his station. Eliza wrapped the bandage around his palm, her fingers lingering on his wrist, feeling the slow, heavy beat of his pulse, a rhythm that felt like a countdown. "He's a bully," she whispered, the treasonous words tasting sweet on her tongue, "and you didn't deserve that," though she knew deserve had nothing to do with the mechanics of their world. Calvin watched her, his dark eyes analyzing her face, searching for the pity he detested, but finding only a genuine, exhausted empathy that seemed to disarm him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, foil-wrapped chocolate, a leftover from the gala favor bags, and offered it to her with a hesitation that broke her heart. It was a gesture of absurd tenderness in a brutal place, a reversing of roles where the man with nothing offered sustenance to the woman who organized feasts. They sat in the silence of the loading dock, sharing the chocolate, the sweetness a sharp contrast to the bitter cold of the evening air. For the first time in years, Eliza felt seen, not as a functionary or a subordinate, but as a person carrying a weight too heavy for one set of shoulders. But kindness in a corporate autocracy is a vulnerability, a crack in the armor that predators like Malcolm Vane are evolutionarily designed to exploit. As she stood to leave, brushing the dust from her skirt, Calvin gripped her arm gently, his eyes urgent. "Don't trust the numbers he shows on the screen tomorrow," he warned, his voice barely audible. "The math doesn't bleed, Eliza, but the people do." Malcolm's office was a shrine to his own ego, a glass-walled fortress overlooking the city he treated as a personal chessboard, where Eliza stood feeling small and scrutinized. He had summoned her under the guise of discussing the gala's seating chart, but the conversation had quickly pivoted to the hospital's funding gaps, a subject he knew was her deepest anxiety. "I can make the deficit disappear," Malcolm said, leaning back in his leather chair, the leather creaking like the hull of a sinking ship. "But I need eyes on the ground, Eliza. People talk to social workers. They complain. They whisper." He slid a check across the mahogany desk, the amount staggering enough to save 20 jobs, including her own, but the price was etched in the silence that followed. He wasn't asking for gratitude, he was buying her loyalty, purchasing a spy to report on the unionizing whispers among the nursing staff and the maintenance crews. Eliza stared at the check, her heart hammering against her ribs, feeling the trap snap shut around her ankle with the precision of a steel jaw. Below them, in the ventilation shafts that snaked through the building's infrastructure, Calvin paused in his work, his head tilted toward the acoustic vibration of the voices filtering down. He wasn't just cleaning ducts, he was mapping the flow of information, understanding the architecture of coercion that held the building together. He heard the hesitation in Eliza's voice, the tremor of moral compromise, and he closed his eyes, disappointed but not surprised by the leverage Malcolm wielded. Back in the office, Malcolm stood and walked to the window, his back to Eliza, a posture of absolute confidence that she would take the bait. "There's a maintenance worker," Malcolm said casually, "Row. He asks too many questions about the shredding schedule. Keep an eye on him for me." The request was a test, a razor wire strung across her path, forcing her to choose between the man who shared his chocolate and the man who held the check. Eliza's fingers touched the paper, the cool slip of wealth against her skin, and she felt a wave of nausea crash over her. "I'll let you know if I see anything," she lied, the words tasting like ash, marking the beginning of her descent. As she left the office, clutching the check that felt like a death warrant, she didn't see the red light of the security camera blinking in the corner. Malcolm turned, a shark-like smile spreading across his face, knowing he had just bought an insurance policy against the one man he couldn't intimidate. The lie began as a shield, a frantic improvisation to keep Calvin from being fired when a crate of expensive pharmaceuticals went missing from the secure storage bay. Security had cornered Calvin, their accusations loud and aggressive, ready to hand him over to the police, when Eliza stepped between them, her voice trembling with false authority. "I sent him there," she stated, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would bruise her ribs. "He was moving boxes for the pediatric drive. I have the requisition forms on my desk." The guards hesitated, the authority of her clipboard and her connection to Malcolm making them pause, their suspicion warring with their fear of administrative reprisal. Calvin looked at her, his expression unreadable, shock and gratitude warring behind the stoic mask he wore for the world. When the guards dispersed, grumbling about paperwork, the silence that stretched between Eliza and Calvin was heavy with the weight of her perjury. "You shouldn't have done that," Calvin said, his voice rough, refusing to look at her, scrubbing a spot on the floor that was already clean. "They'll check the logs. Malcolm checks everything. You just put a target on your back." "I couldn't let them take you," Eliza whispered, the admission stripping away the professional distance she tried to maintain. She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm, the electricity of the forbidden contact making the air hum. He caught her hand, his grip firm, his thumb tracing the pulse at her wrist, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they now shared. They were conspirators now, bound by a lie that could destroy her career and his freedom, a tether tightening with every passing hour. But beneath the fear, there was a blooming warmth, a terrifying realization that she would burn the hospital down to keep him safe. The camera in the hallway pivoted silently, its lens zooming in on their joined hands, recording the evidence of her compromised loyalty. How long can a lie survive in a building made of glass, where every reflection distorts the truth? Calvin pulled Eliza into the boiler room, the heat intense and suffocating, the noise of the machinery providing a sonic shield against the surveillance devices he knew peppered the hallways. He reached behind a loose panel in the wall, pulling out the battered notebook she had seen him retrieve from the mud, and pressed it into her hands. "Look," he commanded, his voice urgent, stripping away the persona of the simple labor to reveal the sharp, terrifying intellect beneath. Eliza opened the pages, expecting ramblings or grievances, but found instead columns of data, precise and devastating. Invoice numbers, timestamps, cross-referenced disposal weights matched against pharmaceutical procurement orders. It was a forensic map of theft on a massive scale. "He's not just embezzling," Calvin explained, pointing to a column of red ink. "He's liquidating assets before the merger. He's gutting the pension fund and hiding it in vendor overpayments." Eliza stared at the numbers, the complexity of the fraud making her head spin, realizing that the man standing before her in a jumpsuit was a genius hiding in plain sight. "Who are you?" she breathed, looking up at him with wide, frightened eyes, seeing the stranger within the friend. "I'm the guy who fixes things," Calvin said grimly, taking the book back and sliding it into his hidden pocket. "And this building is broken at the foundation." He traced the line of her jaw with a gentle, calloused finger, a moment of intimacy stolen in the belly of the beast. "He knows I'm looking, Eliza. That's why he warned you. He's waiting for me to make a mistake." The revelation shifted the ground beneath her feet. Calvin wasn't a victim, he was a hunter waiting for the wind to change. But knowledge is a dangerous burden, and now Eliza carried the weight of a secret that could get them both killed. The steam hissed from a valve, sounding like a warning, as the shadows in the corner seemed to lengthen and reach for them. The charity auction was designed to be the pinnacle of social grace, a spectacle of wealth where the rich bought absolution with tax-deductible donations. Eliza stood by the stage, her headset pressing against her ear, managing the flow of champagne and egos, while Malcolm held court at the center microphone. He was charming, magnetic, spinning a narrative of benevolence while the very people he robbed applauded his generosity. Then, with a cruelty that felt rehearsed, Malcolm called for a toast to the humble workers who made the night possible, gesturing for the staff to come forward. He spotted Calvin in the wings, holding a tray of empty flutes, and beckoned him onto the stage with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come here, son," Malcolm boomed, the microphone amplifying his condescension. "Let's show them who really cleans up our messes." It was a trap, a public flame disguised as recognition, designed to remind the board who held the leash. Eliza moved to stop it, to intercept the humiliation, but the crowd's applause was a wall of sound she couldn't penetrate. Calvin stepped into the spotlight, the glare blinding, looking small and drab against the tuxedos and jewels. Malcolm placed a heavy hand on Calvin's shoulder, squeezing hard enough to bruise. "Maybe if we auction off his mop, we can raise another 1,000, Malcolm joked, the laughter of the room crashing over Calvin like a wave of acid. Calvin didn't shrink. He stood rigid, his eyes locking with Malcolm's, the air between them crackling with a static charge of pure hatred. Then, with a deliberate, clumsy pivot, Calvin turned, and the tray of crystal glasses tipped, cascading onto Malcolm's pristine Italian shoes. The crash of breaking glass silenced the room instantly. It was an accident to the audience, but Eliza saw the precision in the chaos, a tactical strike against Malcolm's vanity. Malcolm's face turned purple, his composure fracturing, while Calvin knelt to pick up the shards, whispering something that only Malcolm could hear. The sealed letter arrived 2 days later, slid under the door of the maintenance closet with no return address, the paper thick and expensive cream vellum. Calvin held it up to the bare light bulb, seeing the watermark of a defunct law firm, a ghost from the past coming to haunt the present. He broke the wax seal, his hands steady, and unfolded the document that confirmed the timeline he had been constructing in his notebook. It was a transfer of deed, a hidden clause in the original hospital charter, proving that the ownership structure was not what the board believed. Eliza found him there, staring at the paper as if it were a holy text, his face pale and set in a grim line. "It's time," he said, handing her the letter, trusting her with the weapon that would start the war. She read the legal jargon, her breath hitching as she realized the implications. Malcolm didn't just steal, he was squatting on an empire he had legally forfeited years ago. "If he finds this, hell kill you," Eliza whispered, the fear for him overriding her fear of the consequences. She moved to the utility sink, a lighter in her hand, desperate to burn the evidence and return to the safety of ignorance. Calvin caught her wrist, his grip gentle but unyielding. "Fire doesn't clean this, Eliza. Only the truth does." He took the lighter from her, his fingers brushing hers, and for a moment, they stood in the impasse of love and survival. The letter sat on the workbench between them, a ticking bomb that had already started its countdown. "They're auditing the department tomorrow," Calvin revealed, his voice dropping. "This letter has to be in the file." It was a suicide mission, and he was asking her to drive the car. The frame-up was elegant in its simplicity, a masterclass in corporate gaslighting that left Eliza reeling and defenseless. She was called into HR, expecting a reprimand for the napkin colors, but found 2 auditors and Malcolm waiting with a file of falsified invoices. "It appears," Malcolm said, his voice dripping with faux disappointment, "that funds from the pediatric grant have been diverted to a private account in your name." He slid the bank statements across the table, perfect forgeries that she had no way to disprove in the moment. The room spun, the air was sucked out of her lungs as she realized the check he had given her was the bait for this exact trap. "I didn't take anything," she stammered, looking at the stony faces of the auditors who had already made up their minds. Malcolm leaned in, the predator smelling blood. "We can handle this quietly," he murmured, "keep the police out of it. If you help us identify the ringleader of the theft ring in maintenance." He didn't say Calvin's name, but it hung in the air, a phantom demand. He was offering her a lifeline made of barbed wire: betray the man she loved or go to prison for a crime she didn't commit. Eliza left the meeting trembling, her reputation incinerated in 20 minutes, walking through the hospital corridors like a ghost. She found Calvin, but she couldn't look him in the eye, the weight of the ultimatum crushing her chest. Trust is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the threat of shackles. She pulled away when he reached for her, the poison of Malcolm's leverage already working through her veins. "What did he say to you?" Calvin asked, but she only shook her head, unable to voice the choice that was tearing her apart. The promotion was a joke, a cruel punchline delivered via interdepartmental memo. Calvin Rowe, promoted to senior coordinator of waste disposal and shredding operations. It came with a 5-cent raise and a basement office that was essentially a converted janitorial closet next to the incinerator. Malcolm's assistant delivered the badge with a smirk, expecting Calvin to refuse, to quit in a storm of indignity. Instead, Calvin took the badge, pinned it to his chest, and thanked her with a polite nod that unnerved her. To the board, it was a way to mock him, to push him further into the trash where they believed he belonged. To Calvin, it was the key to the castle. Eliza watched him accept the role, confusion clouding her judgment. "Why?" she asked him in the cafeteria line, whispering so the cameras wouldn't pick up the desperation in her voice. "He's laughing at you." Calvin stirred his coffee, his eyes scanning the room, landing on the executive elevator. Let him laugh, Calvin replied softly. He just gave me the keys to the shredder room, Eliza. He thinks trash disappears when he throws it away. He looked at her, and for a moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. I need to be where the paper dies. It was a terrifying strategy, walking voluntarily into the lion's den armed only with a trash bag. But Calvin knew that in a corrupt empire, the most dangerous secrets are always thrown away, not filed. He walked toward the basement, the hum of the shredders sounding like a chorus of greeting. The whistleblower file materialized on Eliza's desk inside a mundane manila envelope, hidden beneath a stack of patient charts. It contained photographs, transcripts of illegal board meetings, and the original copy of the sealed letter Calvin had received. It was the smoking gun, the evidence that would send Malcolm to prison for decades. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages, the magnitude of the crime making her nauseous. She locked it in her bottom drawer, her heart racing, planning to give it to Calvin at the shift change. But when she returned from her rounds an hour later, the drawer was unlocked. The file was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through her. She tore the office apart, throwing papers and files, but the envelope had vanished into the ether. Had she been watched? Had Malcolm sent security? Or the thought sickened her, had Calvin taken it to cut a deal? Paranoia is the most effective weapon of the tyrant, turning allies into suspects. She ran to the basement, expecting to find Calvin, but his office was empty, the shredder humming with a hungry idle. On his desk sat a single page from the file, a taunt or a clue. She didn't know who to trust anymore, the silence of the room amplifying her terror. The phone on the wall rang, a shrill, demanding sound. She picked it up, and Malcolm's voice purred on the other end. Did you lose something, Eliza? The line went dead, leaving her holding the receiver, the dial tone sounding like a flatline. The betrayal did not happen in a dark alley, but under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the security office, with 3 cameras recording every twitch of Eliza's face. Malcolm sat across from her, the stolen file on the desk, alongside a tablet displaying a live feed of her mother's nursing home room. Budget cuts are terrible things, Malcolm mused, tapping the screen. Care quality drops so fast. The threat was implicit, monstrous, and undeniable. He pushed a sworn affidavit toward her. It stated that she had witnessed Calvin Rowe breaking into the executive safe. It was a lie that would bury him. Eliza looked at the screen, at her mother's sleeping fragility, and then at the pen. Tears blurred her vision, hot and stinging. She thought of Calvin's kindness, his hands, his justice, but love cannot pay for dialysis. With a sob that sounded like something breaking, she picked up the pen and signed her name. The ink was black, permanent, a stain on her soul. 2 hours later, security dragged Calvin out of the basement. He didn't fight. As they marched him past the glass walls of the office, he locked eyes with Eliza. She expected hate. She expected rage. But he just looked at her with a profound, shattering sorrow, realizing she had been broken, not bad. That look was worse than any scream. Malcolm stood behind her, a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Good girl." She vomited into the trash can the moment the elevator doors closed on Calvin's face. Calvin was gone for 6 days. The hospital rumors said he was in jail, or fled the state, or dead. Eliza moved through her days like a zombie, the guilt of physical weight dragging her down. Then, the first audit notice arrived. It wasn't a standard review, it was a federal forensic inquiry, triggered by an anonymous submission of recovered document fragments. Calvin hadn't fled. He had gone to ground. He wasn't using fists, he was using the very bureaucracy Malcolm mocked. He had taped together the shredded documents from his time in the basement. He reappeared on a Tuesday, standing across the street from the hospital, watching the building. He wore a suit, now cheap, ill-fitting, but a suit. Eliza ran to him, desperate to explain, to beg, to warn him. "Calvin, please," she cried, grabbing his lapel. "He threatened my mother. I didn't have a choice." Calvin gently removed her hand, his touch cold, impersonal. "We all have choices, Eliza," he said, his voice void of the warmth she craved. "You made yours. Now I make mine." He turned and walked into the building, not through the service entrance, but through the front doors, flanked by two men carrying briefcases. He wasn't coming back for her. He was coming for the head of the beast. The revenge was not heat, it was ice. It was slow, mathematical, and absolutely merciless. The auditorium was packed for the annual shareholders' meeting, the air thick with expensive perfume and the tension of a looming crisis. Malcolm stood at the podium, projecting a graph of record profits, sweating under the stage lights as he tried to spin the narrative of success. "Rumors of irregularity are just that," he shouted over the murmur of the crowd. "We are stronger than ever." Then, the doors at the back of the hall swung open with a resounding boom. Calvin walked down the center aisle, the sound of his footsteps echoing like gunshots. He didn't shout. He simply plugged a laptop into the AV station at the front row. The screen behind Malcolm flickered, the profit graph replaced by a live feed of the hospital's offshore accounts showing zero balances. Then, a video played Malcolm in his office, laughing about the idiot donors. The auditorium erupted. Shouts, gasps, the flash of press cameras blinding in their intensity. Malcolm froze, stripped naked in front of the world he desperate tried to impress. Calvin took the microphone from the stand, standing next to the man who had kicked his toolbox. "The board accepts your resignation," Calvin said, his voice amplified, calm, devastating. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you out." The reversal was total. Malcolm was booed off his own stage, a king turned beggar in seconds. But as the crowd cheered for the takedown, Calvin looked up at the balcony where Eliza stood. He didn't smile. He looked tired. The victory was ash in his mouth. The courtroom was a theater of cruelty, the wood paneling dark and oppressive. Malcolm, out on bail, had launched a countersuit, claiming the evidence was fabricated, dragging Eliza onto the stand to destroy her credibility. The defense attorney, a shark in a pinstripe suit, hammered her with questions. "Did you or did you not sign an affidavit stating Mr. Rowe was a thief?" The question hung in the air, a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Malcolm sat at the defense table, smiling, mouthing the words "your mother" to her. The ultimatum was clear: perjure herself again to save Malcolm and herself, or tell the truth and face perjury charges for the first affidavit. The judge leaned forward, impatient. "Answer the question, Miss Hartwell." Eliza looked at Calvin, sitting in the back row. He gave her no signal. No nod. He just watched. This was the moral test she had failed once. She gripped the railing of the witness box. "I signed it," she said, her voice shaking. "Because Malcolm Vane blackmailed me." The courtroom exploded. Malcolm's smile vanished. The judge banged the gavel, but the dam had broken. She chose the truth, knowing it might cost her everything, realizing that freedom was worth more than safety. Calvin closed his eyes, a breath escaping him, a silent acknowledgement of her redemption. But the legal war wasn't over. Malcolm had one card left: the ownership of the building itself. The identity reveal hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Malcolm's lawyer stood up, shouting that Calvin Rowe had no standing to bring the suit, that he was merely a disgruntled janitor. Calvin stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the front of the court. He placed a single document on the judge's bench. "I am not just the plaintiff," Calvin said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I am the lead forensic auditor for the Federal Oversight Commission. And..." He paused, turning to face Malcolm, "I am the sole beneficiary of the Rowe Family Trust." The silence was absolute. "The trust that owns the land this hospital sits on," Calvin continued. "My father built it. You didn't know because you never looked at the janitor's last name." The shockwave was visceral. Calvin wasn't poor. He had walked away from the fortune to investigate the corruption from the inside out. He had lived on minimum wage, scrubbed toilets, and taken the abuse to gather the evidence that money couldn't buy. Malcolm slumped in his chair, realizing he had been treating his landlord like a servant. The disposable man owned the very ground under Malcolm's feet. Eliza stared at Calvin, the betrayal of his secret stinging as much as the relief. He had tested everyone. And almost everyone had failed. The aftermath was a quiet, desolate landscape. Malcolm was in federal custody. The board had been dissolved. Eliza sat on a bench in the hospital garden, a box of her personal items beside her. She had been fired for the initial perjury, despite her cooperation. It was fair. It was just. Calvin approached her, the expensive suit now replaced by jeans and a sweater, looking like a man caught between two lives. He sat on the other end of the bench, a chasm of unspoken words between them. "You own it all?" she asked, looking at the hospital towers. "I own the debt," he corrected gently. "And the responsibility to fix it." He looked at her, the longing evident but tempered by the scar of her betrayal. "I can't hire you back, Eliza. The board wouldn't allow it." "I know," she said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't expect you to." He reached out, covering her hand with his, the touch familiar but changed. "You told the truth when it mattered," he said. "That counts." They sat there as the sun went down, survivors of a war they had won but lost parts of themselves in. He offered her a job at a clinic across town, one he didn't own, but supported. It wasn't a happy ending. It was a new beginning, built on the ruins of the old. Love survived, but it was no longer blind, it was wide awake and terrified. The world loves a hero, but it rarely forgives the human who had to bleed to become one. Calvin Rowe cleared the rot from the foundation, but the cracks in his own heart remained, sealed only by the quiet understanding of a woman who learned the price of integrity the hard way. Justice was served, cold and absolute, yet as they walked in opposite directions under the fading city light, the tragedy wasn't that they were apart, it was that they were finally equals, and it was too late. Sometimes the audit balances the books, but bankrupts the soul. If you believe that truth is worth the cost, hit that subscribe button, not just to watch, but to witness. Share this story if you've ever been underestimated, and comment below, would you have signed the paper to save your family, or burned it to save your soul? I'll be reading your answers. Turn on notifications, the next file is already being declassified.